The loud clang of metal against metal echoed through the Piazza Santa Croce, the ancient square of Florence. The crowd roared as two knights charged at each other, their lances splintering on impact. This was no ordinary day in Florence. It was the grand tournament that would mark the betrothal of Lorenzo de Medici, the heir to the powerful Medici family, to a Roman bride, Clarice Orsini. Lorenzo, just 19 years old, sat tall on his white charger, a vision in his red and white velvet armor. His Medici shield, studded with a glinting diamond, caught the sunlight as he dipped his lance in a show of respect to the queen of the tournament, Lucrezia Donati. She was the young wife of a leading citizen, and widely considered the most beautiful woman in Florence. The crowd cheered as the knights took their positions and the jousts began, but this wasn't just a tournament, it was a political statement. Lorenzo's father, Piero de Medici, was too ill to organize such an event, so the young heir took charge. He knew that this spectacle was crucial to win the hearts of the Florentine people, who were skeptical about his Roman bride. Florence was a city of pride, and many saw the union with a Roman family as a snub to their own noble lineages. The tournament was a grand success, and Lorenzo emerged as the victor, though he later admitted, "I was given the first prize, even though I was not well versed in the use of weapons or skilled in how to inflict blows on my opponent." The crowd's excitement was palpable, and they went home happy, if a bit oblivious to the political maneuvering that had taken place. 4 months later, Clarice Orsini arrived in Florence for her wedding. She rode into the city on the same white charger that Lorenzo had ridden in the tournament, a gift from the King of Naples. The wedding was a lavish affair, with 3 days of banquets at the Palazzo Medici. The courtyard and gardens were filled with tables of wild boar and suckling pig, and the air was thick with the scent of roasting meats and the sound of minstrels playing from the balconies. By the end, more than 300 barrels of the finest Tuscan wine had been emptied, and the guests danced beneath the entwined arms of the Orsini and Medici families. However, the marriage was not a match made in heaven. Lorenzo, with his charismatic ugliness and poetic charm, was a difficult man to live with. He wrote amorous sonnets to Lucrezia Donati and other beauties of Florence, while Clarice, a frumpy and somewhat dull young woman, struggled to fit into the sophisticated Florentine society. She often looked down on it, and her disapproving attitude sometimes caused tension. Despite this, they made an effort to maintain the appearance of a normal marriage, and eventually they had 10 children, though 3 did not survive childhood. The happiness of the wedding bells was short-lived. Within months, Lorenzo's father, Piero, passed away, and the young heir found himself at the helm of the Medici family. He took stock of the family's vast wealth, which included a thriving Medici bank, and he was determined to maintain and expand their power. His first test came soon after, when a group of rebels, led by the vindictive Bernardo Nardi, launched an invasion of Prato, a town just 10 miles from Florence. The rebels were quickly captured and hanged by the local mayor, Cesare Petrucci, whose swift action saved Florence from a potential disaster. Lorenzo, impressed by Petrucci's loyalty, marked him for future promotion, a move that would later prove crucial. The challenges continued. Inside Florence, the city's political machine faced unexpected opposition. The Standing Council refused to appoint Medici recommendations, leading to a return to more democratic elections. Lorenzo bided his time, waiting for the right moment to reassert Medici control. He eventually succeeded, installing a system that left the Medici firmly in charge of all major councils. Lorenzo's next move was to strengthen Florence's foreign relations. In 1471, he invited Galeazzo, Duke of Milan, and his wife Bona to a state visit. The Duke arrived with a grand retinue, and the city was once again filled with pageants and celebrations. Galeazzo was so inspired by the cultural richness of Florence that he returned to Milan, determined to commission artists and architects to adorn his own city. This visit, however, did not sit well with Ferrante, King of Naples, who had sent a magnificent white charger for Lorenzo's wedding and expected to be treated with similar grandeur. The political landscape of Italy was as complex and devious as ever. In 1471, Pope Paul II died, and Pope Sixtus IV, a more determined and ambitious figure, took his place. Lorenzo led the Florentine delegation to Rome to congratulate the new pope, who agreed to continue the papal account with the Medici Bank. However, Sixtus IV was reluctant to make Lorenzo's younger brother, Giuliano, a cardinal, a decision that would have significant implications for the Medici family's ambitions. Lorenzo's challenges were far from over. A crisis loomed in Volterra, a town under Florentine rule, where a dispute over an alum mining concession led to a riot. Florentine officials were killed, and the local mayor, a Medici appointee, barely escaped with his life. This event was just the beginning of a series of political and personal trials that would test the young ruler's mettle and shape the future of Florence. Lorenzo de Medici, the leader of Florence, made a tough decision. He sent a mercenary army led by Montefeltro to quell a rebellion in Volterra. The city, fearing for its freedom, asked for help from Venice and Naples, but no one came. After a month-long siege, Volterra surrendered. However, Montefeltro's mercenaries went wild, causing chaos and misery. When Lorenzo learned about the atrocities, he was shocked. He immediately went to Volterra to try to make things right, handing out money to the victims. Despite his efforts, the incident haunted him, showing that he still had much to learn about leadership. In December 1476, tensions in Italy were high. Galeazzo, the Duke of Milan, was assassinated, leaving his wife Bona of Savoy to rule. This left Florence, which was allied with Milan, in a vulnerable position. Meanwhile, Pope Sixtus IV was expanding his control in the Romagna region. He promoted nepotism, favoring his relatives, and appointed his young nephew, Piero Riario, as cardinal and archbishop of Florence. Piero's outrageous behavior, like giving his mistresses gold chamber pots, only added to the city's frustration. Sixtus IV also wanted to buy the city of Imola and give it to his other nephew, Girolamo Riario, who was rumored to be his son. Imola was important to Florence, and Sixtus needed a loan to buy it. He asked the Medici bank for money, but Lorenzo was hesitant. The Pope was already in debt to the Medici, and Imola's strategic location made it too valuable to lose. Lorenzo stalled, and the Pope, enraged, moved his account to the Pazzi Bank, the Medici's main rival. The Pazzi family, one of Florence's oldest and wealthiest, had a long-standing rivalry with the Medici. Francesco de Pazzi, who managed the Pazzi Bank in Rome, was bitter about the Medici's power and wealth. He saw an opportunity to strike. He approached Girolamo Riario and Francesco Salviati, the Archbishop of Pisa, who were both enemies of Lorenzo. They agreed to help assassinate Lorenzo and his brother, Giuliano, during a mass in the cathedral. The conspirators also sought the support of Jacopo de Pazzi, the head of the Pazzi family. Initially, Jacopo was skeptical, but he was convinced after learning that the Pope had blessed the plan. They planned to strike on April 26, 1478, during Mass. The signal for the assassination would be the raising of the host. On the day of the attack, everything went wrong. Giuliano was killed, but Lorenzo survived. Panic and chaos ensued. Many conspirators were caught and executed. Jacopo de Pazzi, in a desperate attempt to escape, fled Florence but was captured and brought back. He was publicly humiliated, tortured, and hanged. His body was dragged through the streets by a mob, and eventually his remains were thrown into the Arno River. This brutal spectacle revealed the deep-seated anger and resentment that simmered beneath the surface of Florence. The failed conspiracy and the brutal aftermath sent shockwaves through Italy. Pope Sixtus IV, enraged by the execution of his archbishop, excommunicated Lorenzo and the entire Florentine Republic. He demanded that Lorenzo be handed over for trial, and he ordered the confiscation of Medici assets in Rome. The city of Florence, now under intense pressure, had to find a way to survive and protect its leader. The citizens of Florence were not scared when they heard the Pope's angry news that everyone who supported Lorenzo de Medici was excommunicated. They were mad and told the Pope they didn't care. The bishops of Tuscany, who were also excommunicated, met in the big cathedral in Florence. They said the city leaders, the Signoria, were right to protect Florence from the bad guys. They even wrote their own paper, saying the Pope was excommunicated, and they used the new printing press in Florence to spread their message. This meant more people read about it than the Pope's message, but then things got worse. The Pope, Sixtus IV, was really angry and declared war on Florence. He got King Ferrante of Naples to help him. Florence found out it was almost alone. The Orsini family tried to get their army ready, but it wasn't much help. Milan was having its own problems, and only sent a small group. Venice thought Florence was doomed. and also sent just a few soldiers. As a last hope, Lorenzo got the Duke of Ferrara and his small army to help lead the Florentine forces. The Pope's army, led by the Duke of Urbino, joined with a big army from Naples led by the Duke of Calabria. The Duke of Calabria moved his army into Florentine territory. The Duke of Ferrara, who was supposed to protect Florence, kept retreating. The leaders in Florence were upset and asked why they were paying him if he wouldn't fight. The Duke of Calabria kept moving forward and reached the town of Cal, where the people refused to give up. After 2 months of fighting, Cal fell, but it was already winter, so the Neapolitan army went to Siena to wait out the cold. The Duke of Ferrara and the Milanese troops went home. Things were getting bad in Tuscany. Groups of bandits were pretending to be scouts and were terrorizing the countryside. In Florence, people were scared and angry. Food was running low, and taxes were very high to pay for the war. The wool trade was also not doing well, which meant many people were losing their jobs and facing hunger. Then, to make things worse, the bubonic plague started spreading in the Santa Croce district. The war just kept going on and on. At the end of 1479, Lorenzo de Medici saw how much the people of Florence were suffering. He decided to take a big risk. He wrote a letter to the city leaders, saying he would go to Naples to talk to King Ferrante and try to make peace. He said he would do anything, even risk his life, to help Florence. Many of the city leaders were moved to tears when they read his letter. Lorenzo left Florence and went to Pisa. He wrote to the city leaders that he was going to Naples to make peace. Some people think Lorenzo had already talked to Ferrante in secret, and Ferrante had sent a ship to pick him up. Others say Ferrante was very unpredictable and might have wanted to hurt Lorenzo. But when Lorenzo arrived in Naples, he was welcomed by Ferrante's son, Federigo. Lorenzo knew Ferrante was tricky, so he started to win over the people of Naples. He gave freedom to the galley slaves who rowed his ships, gave them money and clothes, and helped poor families pay for their daughters' weddings. He also gave money to charities and sponsored festivals. He was charming and confident during the day, but at night he was often very sad and worried. He wrote poems that showed both his strength and his fears. Lorenzo spent a lot of money in Naples, but it's not clear where all the money came from. The Medici Bank was having financial problems, and the branches in London and Bruges were in debt. Before leaving Florence, Lorenzo had raised 60,000 florins by mortgaging his estate. Some people think he took money from the Florentine treasury to help the Medici. One document shows he took 74,948 florins without permission. Historians think he might have done this to help both the Medici and Florence. King Ferrante had his own problems. The Turkish fleet was a threat, and the King of France was making claims to Naples. Ferrante finally agreed to a peace treaty with Florence. The Pope was furious but had no choice and also signed the treaty. Lorenzo returned to Florence as a hero. He used this to strengthen his control of the government. A new council of 70 men was created, and they had more power than the Signoria. Lorenzo's loyal friend, Tommaso Sodrini, became an ambassador to avoid building his own power base in Florence. In 1480, the Turkish Sultan Mehmet the Conqueror landed in southern Italy and took the port of Otranto. The Pope called for all of Italy to defend Christendom, and the Italian states, including Florence, responded. The Pope and Lorenzo made peace because they needed to work together. The Turks left after a year when Mehmet died, and a new sultan took over. Italy remained mostly peaceful for the rest of Lorenzo's life. Lorenzo became a respected statesman, known as the needle of the Italian compass, because he could help point the way forward in difficult times. During this peaceful period, Lorenzo's patronage of the arts flourished. He became known as Lorenzo the Magnificent. He supported many artists and poets, including Angelo Poliziano, who became a close friend and tutor to Lorenzo's son, Piero. Poliziano was a talented poet and scholar, and he and Lorenzo shared a love of learning and a zest for life. They became very close, and Poliziano often wrote about his deep admiration for Lorenzo. A painting from this time shows Poliziano with the young Piero, both looking thoughtful and intelligent. This period was a golden age for Florence, thanks to Lorenzo's leadership and his support of the arts. Poliziano, or Angelo Poliziano as he was fully known, was a brilliant scholar and poet who lived during the Renaissance in Florence, Italy. He was a close friend and tutor to the powerful Medici family, particularly to Lorenzo de Medici, known as Lorenzo the Magnificent. Poliziano was a man of many talents. He could speak Greek fluently, and often conversed with the Greek scholar Argyropoulos. He even debated Plato's philosophy with Marsilio Ficino, a leading figure in the Renaissance. Poliziano's early poetry was written in classical Latin, and he was also skilled in writing Greek epigrams. However, Lorenzo convinced him to write in Tuscan, the local language, which was becoming more popular. One of Poliziano's famous works in Tuscan was The Joust of Giuliano de Medici, a poem that described the love between Giuliano de Medici and the beautiful Simonetta Vespucci. This poem was meant to be a private joke among Lorenzo's circle, as Giuliano liked to think of himself as a heartless womanizer, but in reality, he often fell in love and got his heart broken. On April 26, 1478, a tragic event occurred. The Pazzi conspiracy, a plot to assassinate the Medici family, unfolded. Poliziano was standing next to Lorenzo when the attack happened. Although he claimed to have played a heroic role in saving Lorenzo's life, it's more likely that he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Later that day, he witnessed the execution of Francesco Salviati, the Archbishop of Pisa, who was thrown from a window with a rope around his neck. Poliziano's vivid descriptions of the event, including Salviati's desperate attempts to bite his executioner, show his keen eye for detail. After the conspiracy, Florence faced threats from the Neapolitan army and a plague outbreak. Lorenzo sent his family and Poliziano to Pistoia for safety. Poliziano wrote to Lorenzo, describing their life in the countryside. He mentioned the generous locals who brought them fresh produce, but he was actually bored by the lack of intellectual stimulation. The situation worsened when they moved to Cafagolo for the winter, and Poliziano grew even more despondent. Lorenzo's wife, Clarice, was also unwell, suffering from what would later become tuberculosis. The relationship between Poliziano and Clarice became strained. Clarice was upset that Poliziano was teaching her children from pagan texts, and she demanded that they learn from Christian texts instead. Poliziano refused, and Clarice, already unhappy with the rural life, had him thrown out. Both Poliziano and Clarice wrote to Lorenzo to plead their cases, but Lorenzo was busy dealing with the Medici bank's financial troubles and the advancing Neapolitan army. Poliziano, feeling rejected, left Tuscany and went to the court of Cardinal Gonzaga in Mantua. After a year, Lorenzo invited him back to Florence and arranged for him to become a professor of Greek and Latin at the university and a canon of the cathedral. However, he was no longer allowed to live at the Medici palace. Lorenzo also hired Poliziano to tutor his second son, Giovanni, who was made a cardinal at the young age of 13. Giovanni, despite his unprepossessing appearance, showed intelligence and determination, but Poliziano's influence on him would have significant consequences in the future. During this time, Poliziano wrote some of his best poetry in Tuscan, which helped establish the language as a sophisticated means of expression. His poetry and the new social concept of the gentiluomo gentleman spread throughout Italy. The idea of a gentleman, characterized by gentle manners, speech, and a cultured appreciation of the arts, was no longer limited to the nobility. It became a goal for a wider section of society, including merchants, civil servants, and military officers. One of Poliziano's most famous works is Orpheus, a 5-act verse drama written in a single day for one of Lorenzo's carnivals. The story follows the legend of Orpheus, who uses his music to charm the underworld and bring back his beloved Eurydice. However, Orpheus loses Eurydice when he looks back at her, and he later descends into carnal behavior, seducing young men. The play ends with Orpheus being torn apart by drunken worshippers of Bacchus. The plot's twists and turns, especially the suggestive elements, hint at deeper meanings that may have been intended for Lorenzo and his humanist friends. Poliziano's life and work suggest that he was homosexual, a fact that adds a layer of complexity to his relationship with Lorenzo. Some accounts even suggest that their attachment may have been more than platonic. A story about Poliziano's death, where he was said to have rushed out of his house to play the lute under the window of a young Greek boy he loved, further supports this idea. Among Poliziano's contemporaries was Pico della Mirandola, a brilliant philosopher and polymath. Pico, born in 1463, was a prodigy who studied in Padua and Paris, learning multiple languages and a wide range of subjects. He settled in Florence in 1484 and quickly became a star among the intellectuals. Pico was known for his beauty and his vast knowledge, which included everything from the Kabbalah to Greek mathematics. His most famous work, On the Dignity of Man, expressed the idea that humans have the freedom to shape their own destiny, a core principle of Renaissance humanism. Pico's goal was to synthesize the best elements from all branches of knowledge into a universal philosophy. His ambitious project, though not fully realized, laid the groundwork for the scientific revolution of the next century. Pico's influence on Renaissance thought, combined with Poliziano's contributions to literature and the concept of the gentleman, helped shape the cultural and intellectual landscape of the time. Pico della Mirandola's daring and controversial 900 Theses of 1486 were a bold attempt to merge knowledge from various cultures into a universal belief system. His challenge to debate these ideas in Rome was met with a papal crackdown, labeling 13 of his theses as heretical. Among these, two stood out: the idea that our beliefs are not entirely within our control, and the assertion that the soul can only be certain of itself. These insights foreshadowed modern philosophical concepts, like Descartes' famous, "I think, therefore I am." Pico's other theses, however, were more problematic, suggesting that magic and Kabbalistic practices could prove Christ's divinity. This led to his arrest and a brief period of exile, until his friend Lorenzo de Medici intervened and secured his release. Pico's life, marked by both intellectual brilliance and personal turmoil, ended tragically at the age of 31, possibly due to poisoning. Lorenzo de Medici, known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, was a pivotal figure in the Renaissance. He inherited his artistic and creative temperament from his mother, Lucrezia, and grew up in the vibrant intellectual atmosphere of the Palazzo Medici. During his lifetime, the palace became a hub for artists like Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, and Michelangelo, who all spent time there and were influenced by the Medici's patronage. Botticelli, born Alessandro Filippi, was a difficult child who eventually found his calling as an artist. He was taken under the wing of the Medici family and lived at the Palazzo Medici. His paintings, such as the Adoration of the Magi and Primavera, reflect the Platonic ideals and classical mythology that flourished in Lorenzo's court. Despite his artistic genius, Botticelli was known for his sensitive and sometimes eccentric personality, deeply affected by the world around him. Leonardo da Vinci, born in 1452, had a unique upbringing. Raised by his grandmother and later by his father, he moved to Florence at the age of 12. His early life was marked by the love and support of the women in his family, which may have contributed to his self-confidence and later his homosexuality. Lorenzo de Medici played a crucial role in Leonardo's career, recommending him to work in Rome and supporting his artistic endeavors. The Medici family, especially Lorenzo, were not just patrons of the arts, but also political and cultural leaders. They used art to promote Florence's status and to foster alliances. Botticelli's Pazzi Conspirators painting, for example, was a political statement that reinforced loyalty and punished traitors. Despite his love for art, Lorenzo's patronage was selective, often prioritizing his collection of jewels over paintings. The Renaissance was a time of great change, and art began to reflect this. Paintings moved from being purely religious to becoming secular, private possessions. Artists like Botticelli and Leonardo da Vinci were at the forefront of this transformation, creating works that were not only beautiful, but also deeply philosophical. Their art was a celebration of human potential and the rediscovery of ancient knowledge, marking the transition from the medieval to the modern world. In the end, the legacy of the Medici family, particularly Lorenzo the Magnificent, was not just in the art they commissioned, but in the cultural and intellectual environment they fostered. This environment allowed artists and thinkers like Pico della Mirandola, Botticelli, and Leonardo da Vinci to flourish, leaving an indelible mark on the Renaissance and the world that followed.